Thanks all. Thank you, Cheryl. Congrats to our scholarship winners. A very competitive scholarship, and it's one of the bright spots of this job is being able to work with our best students and be able to help them along the way. So again, congratulations. It's well deserved. Something else that's well deserved, and I promised I would try and draw everybody's attention to her tonight, is Kathy Wrigley, standing up in the back here. I tried to embarrass her, honestly though, none of this would really happen without her support. Every little piece from scheduling rooms, to food, to scholarships, to working with the students. I mean, the list is long enough to where I can't really spell it all out here, but your help is greatly appreciated, Kathy. Thank you. You're really the glue that holds us together. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of being able to introduce Dr. Monroy. Dr. Monroy, as you know, is a professor emeritus of history at the Colorado College. He's a native of Los Angeles. He's a graduate of the University of California, Los Angeles. His most recent book is titled The Borders Within: The Encounters Between Mexico and the U.S. And it's a work of quote-unquote creative nonfiction. Since arriving at CMU's campus, Dr. Monroy has been teaching a course titled The New World Border: The Causes and Consequences of Human Migrations. And tonight, Dr. Monroy will deliver a talk titled On Bravery in This New World: Global Climate Change, Poverty, and People on the Move. Very happy to have him here, and I think we're all in for a good talk. So if we could all round of applause for Dr. Monroy. Welcome.
Thank you, Justin Gold, for that fine introduction. I thought it would be easy to speak on migration because that's what I've been writing about and researching about for literally decades. Then Putin invaded Ukraine. And I couldn't do this presentation without addressing the desperate migration of Ukrainians from their homeland. I really couldn't. So nearly 5 million people. There we go. To connect these migrations, the ones I'm going to talk about from Mexico, Central America, and Africa, and to connect those with these shadowing events in Eastern Europe is a challenge. I'd certainly like to thank my hosts here at the Aspinall Foundation for this challenge, but not Vladimir Putin. I'd like to thank the Wayne Aspinall Foundation and its board, Professor Justin Golub, who forwarded to me the wonderful news that I had been selected as the DAB chair. And of course, Kathy Wrigley, who you all know by now is the one who makes all this possible. She's made me feel so at home here. I also like the idea of the Aspinall Foundation. My father's family is from Mexico. My mother's family, my mother and my grandmother, were both born in Uruguay a long time ago. And 1930, when Mr. Aspinall was first elected to the State House of Representatives, I don't think my grandmother could have voted for him because she was in a district somewhat to the south. But in 1939, when the district was expanded and he ran for state senate, likely they voted for him, curiously enough. Excuse me, I have to drink water. So, there we go. These stories are so complicated, we really have to jump in somewhere. I'm going to try and unify these migrations out of Africa, Central America, and Mexico, ones that have been intensified by global climate change, those on the one hand, and out of Ukraine on the other, by arguing that these dramatic scenes of people on the move, out of Mariupol and Kiev, out of Central America towards the US border, are emblematic of how the world is a different place now. That we are living in a watershed moment, in other words. And I'll explain this as well as I can throughout this. The end of the Cold War era the end of the Cold War era, right? Let's see how I do with this. The end of the Cold War and the end of World War II brought to an end, we thought, of that most horrible theater of European conflict. That is the killing zone, the area between Germany and Russia that includes Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and Western Russia. The invasion of Ukraine has, and the resulting world crisis, has ended what I would call the post-Cold War era. We are now in the post-Ukraine era. The world is a different place, and I'll try and explain that. I would also say that these new migrations are changing both the American immigrant narrative and the notion of the U.S. as a nation that grew from east to west. We all remember studying the westward movement in high school and junior high school. As a nation that grew from sea to shining sea. When the president called, the former president, called the scene at the border a national emergency, when torch-bearing protesters in Charlottesville, North Carolina, Virginia, chanted anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant slogans, we are witnessing what has been called aggrieved nationalism. And that's going to be a big theme for me today. What, in other words, unites the so-called alt-right of Germany, France, Hungary, and indeed the US is aggrieved nationalism. And I think also that's what motivates Vladimir Putin. And we'll get to that in a moment. For what aggrieves Vladimir Putin is what he perceives as the encroachment by NATO. American and Western braggadocio about winning the Cold War. Well, we didn't win the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapsed of its own internal contradictions, its own lethargy, its own corruption, and other things that we could mention. In Russia, Putin is so upset about the alleged importation of what he calls Western values, such as secularism, such as equality for women, such as lesbian and gay rights, and democracy, which in his view is something that divides people instead of uniting people under the notion of the great mother Russia. I would say also that part of what has so troubled so many Americans, so many of these people, and as much as I don't like them, I try and be empathetic. Well, it's impossible. Sympathetic, try and understand them. And I think that for non-Hispanic, non-Asian Americans, the transformation in the transformation in the paradigms of the American West, the American movement, is something profoundly troubling. And also, how it is that America became a nation of immigrants. Westward movement and the nation of immigrants. And by the way, for Asian immigrants to California, and more Asians are coming through LA International Airport per day than came through Ellis Island. California is not the end of America. California is the beginning of America, from which they have fanned out to places like Hmong people, the tribes people from Vietnam, who are in Minnesota, Cambodians who are in Texas. California is the beginning place, not the ending place for them. So when it comes to the American West, it has really been mostly Native Americans who have challenged the notion of this mythology of a holy mission into the wilderness. This is a famous painting that is in the Congress by a man named Emmanuel Lutz. And oh shoot. Come on. Press the right button. Yeah, you see here, I hope you can see it, that we have here a woman with a child. It's the image of a Madonna and child. It's kind of a, this is Cal George Bingham, the immigration of Daniel Boone through the Appalachian Mountains. Again, you see we have a woman, you can't really see the baby, but it's something that is very Christian, very much a holy, very God-ordained movement. And we see that, of course, in Giotto's painting of the journey into Egypt. Now later there were other Madonnas, the tragic Madonnas moving from east to west. This is a famous photograph by Dorothea Lange of an Okie moving to California. Again, it's the image of a Madonna and child. What is disturbing is that there are now new Madonnas. This is New York. What's happened here is that people from a particular village in Mexico, in honor of the Virgin Mary, in honor of Dia de la Virgen, December 12th, they have marched in procession in a relay from their village on the east coast of Mexico with this Virgin Mary all the way to New York. Isn't that interesting that these new Madonnas are going from south to north? Another one, huge throng in Denver, that's from the Denver Post. A huge throng in Denver celebrating Dia de la Virgen. Interestingly enough. And this is a challenge to this notion of the holy errand into the wilderness, the narrative of the westward movement. Because now, especially with Native American people speaking on these things, we know that there is a counter-narrative, that is, that it was a brutal conquest of the native peoples, of the native lands, and in fact of the animals. And remember, it's the stories of a place that give people their sense of belonging. So I think that part of the reason for things that happen in Charlottesville and other places, is that people are told they don't belong, where the old narrative has told them that, of course, they do belong. Okay. We want a good story about why we're here. We don't want a story that is about destruction. People become aggrieved, and I think this is part of the reason that there is so much hubbub in school board meetings and in state legislatures about the textbooks. Now, some other examples here. This is one of the great symbols of the settling of the West. And that is a New England-style church planted in the West. This is on the west side of Colorado Springs. I mean, really, talk about civilizing. Except now, if you look carefully, what is that church now? You can't read it. It says, Iglesia Rey de Reyes, Church of the King of Kings. It's a Mexican evangelical church that has taken over this symbol of the settling of the West namely a sweet little Protestant New England church. Okay. Okay. Now, that's the version of Guadalupe. If you're going to understand Mexican migration, you have to understand the version of Guadalupe quickly. You notice that she has a purple sash around her waist. That is the Aztec indication that a woman is with child. Okay, that's there. You can see she's being held up by the so-called Indian boy, Juan Diego. It's a long story. I don't have time to go into it. If you want to do it in the questions, you can. Now, he was in his 40s when she appeared to him. And, but he's the first Native American saint. He was recently sanctified by Pope Francis I. You see also the way she holds her hands. She holds her hands not in the Catholic or Christian form of supplication, that is asking for, but in the traditional native way of offering. See the difference? This is offering. So that in Dia de la Virgen, or on your saint's day, you don't ask for something, you don't supplicate. You bring ofertas. You might bring a little bit of food, you might bring some shoes, you might bring a leather moccasin for the baby that she's going to have. Okay, so again, which way is the migration? East to west? Nope. South to north. Okay, now this is, of course, the old narrative of immigration. That is a very famous photograph by Alfred Stieglitz. Stieglitz was the one who established photography as an art form in New York City. And this is called the steerage. And it's interesting for a number of reasons. Okay, so you see here that the gangplank divides the photograph in two. It's also kind of social commentary, because you see up here are better off immigrants. And you see down here in the steerage are the poor ones. All this is in New York Harbor. So the idea is that people get off the boat or whatever. They go to night school, they learn English. Right? They learn American, They learn American ways. This says, this is to certify that Mrs. Gonzalez, a student in ICG high school, by examination shows a knowledge of the English language. And there she is. I wish that came out a little stronger. So the idea is you learn some English, you learn how to dress American, and then you assimilate into American mainstream life and become a hyphenated American, more likely your children. But there's a couple of issues here. One is that in Stieglitz's famous photograph, those are immigrants going back. They're headed back to the port of Bremen in Germany. Now, I don't know who those folks are, but I do know that probably a third of Italians went back to Italy, a third of Poles went back to Poland, because their goal was not to come here and become American. Their goal was for a single man to come here, earn money, go back home, and buy a small farm, or maybe a small business. The goal was not to sell it. Now, of course, what happens is you get a job in a steel mill or something like that, and you wind up sending for your family. Yeah. Another one. She never became a citizen. She never did. She always thought she would go back to Mexico. Always thought that she would. I know, because that's my grandmother. certainly the narrative has been true for so many people. You know, and I must say that I'm part of that narrative. Oh, shoot. See that kid? Probably 10 years old, 1926. That's him at his 100th birthday in El Monte, California. That's his baby sister, whose 100th birthday I just went to. That's his son, you might recognize him. That's a grandchild who's an attorney in Denver. That's his granddaughter, my sister, who's a cowgirl, drives the Ford F-350. So yes, there is truth to this, and I'm that narrative. But that narrative is not so simple. That's the old story. But there's a new story now, and it's one of globalization. And to me, this makes things different. The UN estimates that 110 million people in the world are on the move. And that includes a lot of people on internal migration. The largest number is in China, where people are fleeing the impoverished countryside for the opportunity of the big cities, the ones that we see in the news all the time. That's also true of Mexico. Most of Mexico's migration is internal. A good example, excuse me. Here's a good example of how and why this is happening. No. An article from the New York Times. NAFTA to open floodgates engulfing rural Mexico. Now, NAFTA is about free trade. Well, actually, if it were about just free trade, it wouldn't be a 1,200-page document, it would be a one-page document that says free trade. But everything's more complicated. Okay, so one of the things that happened was that Mexico agreed that there would be no more tariffs on the importation of American agricultural goods, that is corn, hogs, and so on. Now, I don't know if you've ever driven through the Midwest, especially Iowa and Missouri, and seen or smelled an American hog farm. It's industrial hog raising. These huge, what do we call them, factories. You see how Mr. Guerrero is raising his hogs, they're just running around. So that it costs about 1/5 in the United States the cost as it costs in Mexico, 5 times as much in Mexico, to raise and market a hog. 500 times more, 5 times more to raise and market a hog in Mexico. So once this happened, once NAFTA came about, Mr. Guerrero can't compete, can he? So he laid off all but 5 of his 46 workers. Interestingly enough, and also important, the U.S. hog farms get subsidies. Mexico, because it's a poor country and because there's corruption, cannot give its hog farmers subsidies. The peso crisis, corruption, and so on. On the plus side, it means that pork is much cheaper now in Mexico. If you're living in Mexico City or Guadalajara or Acapulco or whatever, you can buy pork in the market for less money. Right after NAFTA, corn exports to Mexico tripled. The price of corn went from $5 a bushel in U.S. money in Mexico to $1.80 a bushel in Mexico. Now, Mexican corn farmers are still farming with a plow and a burro and a little kid putting corn into the rows. Can they compete? No. Bread is cheaper. In Mexico, the main producer of bread is called Bimbo. Bimbo bread is cheaper. And you can even buy it here. I don't know if it's at your city market, but it's at my King Soopers. So NAFTA's been good for American agribusiness, good for urban consumers of agricultural goods in the cities, but a disaster for the roughly 23 to 25 million Mexican corn farmers who are farming corn much like their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. Now, interestingly enough, Mr. Guerrero says that half his workers are going to migrate within Mexico. The other half are going to try and migrate to the United States. So you see that NAFTA has the consequence of disrupting people and their lives that they've had for ages, 1,000 years, and sending them on the move. Where will those workers go? Ironically enough, maybe to the hog processing plants in Iowa. In other words, the system is working here in a very curious sort of way. In other words, lives are disrupted in Mexico, but they go to the United States where their labor is desperately needed. I mean, imagine working in a hog processing plant, killing animals. The animals are screaming. Sometimes the kill goes wrong and there's blood and guts everywhere, chopping them up. You know, you're not going to find Americans who will do that for $10 an hour. Now, way back when, in the time of Yergis and the jungle out in Sinclair, they eventually had a union. The work wasn't any better, but you made enough money to have a life. Where else might they go? Maybe pick strawberries. Here's one of my favorite bits of data. And that is, it takes 3, what we used to call man hours, 3 human hours to cultivate an acre of wheat. 70 person hours to cultivate an acre of asparagus. 2,150 person hours to cultivate, harvest an acre of strawberries. You like strawberries? Think about it. I know I'm filling you with all this stuff. My point is not to make you feel guilty. Not at all. I eat strawberries like crazy. Next, let's rush ahead to Central America. Oh, are those Mr. Guerrero's workers? I don't know. Headed north. Strawberries, delicious. That's really hard work. Because of the pesticides they use, the life expectancy is 49 years for somebody working in strawberries. Of course, there's disaster in these migrations. I took that photograph from the Tijuana side of the border. And these are mentions of the muertos, the people who have died crossing the border. The coffins commemorating those who have died. It's the Madonnas here. Okay, let's go to El Salvador quickly. Those who are migrating from El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras are struggling against violence, terrible violence. Gang violence of the infamous Mara Salvatruchas, M13, they're often in the news. A a gang that started in Los Angeles. All too often, a mother's son in El Salvador has three choices: join a gang, be killed, or flee. And we have another version of the Virgin. And I think this is an important emblematic one for mothers whose sons have gone north, who are facing gang violence. And this is Nuestra Señora de los Dolores, Our Lady of Sorrows. While the Virgin Guadalupe celebrates the Virgin Mary with child, Our Lady of Sorrows is about the mother who has lost her son. In other words, of course, that's another part of the story of the Virgin Mary. She lost her son to the world of violence, of male violence and so on. And she's usually portrayed with daggers on her heart. You can't really see that. There's also political violence. Now, this is a place where it's so complicated about why a country like Central America, Guatemala, is so poor. Certainly it has a lot to do with the legacy of Spanish colonialism, of the construction of places that are meant purely for the profit of the crown, or the profit of governors and viceroys and so on. Political leaders understand that that's what you do when you get in office. Get rich. That, in part, is a legacy of Spanish colonialism. But it also has a lot to do with Cold War politics. I mean, I could go on and on and on. 1932 is a peasant revolt in El Salvador, wanting their lands actually back if they are Indians. A guy named General Hernandez Martinez, if you really want to know, supported by the United States, instituted a reign of terror. 1972, Jose Napoleon Duarte, a liberal reformer, wins the presidential election promising land reform. Well, El Salvador's ruling families responded by creating paramilitary forces, saying that these people are communists, thus influencing Nixon and Henry Kissinger to send them lots of arms. 1980, all hell breaks loose in El Salvador. There's a leader there named Roberto Dobizon. You maybe remember, some of you who are older, the assassination of Archbishop Romero. Interestingly enough, Pope Francis has made him a saint too. Interestingly enough. Squads of paramilitaries trained at the School of the Americas were the ones who were responsible. In all, at least 75,000 flee during this violence, and 500,000 flee to the United States. Approximately 1 in 4 Salvadorians lives in the United States. And again, can we say, I'm a historian, we love the notion of multiple causes. What's the cause of this? I said, well, it's not so simple. It depends who you ask. And anybody here is a historian will say, well, there's at least 5 or 6 main causes. All right, so there is frankly some U.S. role in the troubles of, say, El Salvador. There are other troubles too. There were agreements made as a solution to the Civil War about keeping textile jobs in El Salvador. It lasted a little while, then they went to China and Bangladesh. And then, of course, there's the El Nino cycle. So, multiple causation, yes. Nonetheless, in the last 60 years, temperatures in El Salvador have increased by 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's critical. The rain. Since Toltec days, people have been raising corn. It's not clear, but it looks like Toltec agronomists or Olmec fashioned corn, hybridized corn from reeds. This is Ramon Campos Lopez, there won't be a testament, who has been farming there, his family has been farming there for generations. Look at his corn. It's all dried up. Okay? Yes, the soil is getting tired from having grown corn for 1,000, 2,000 years. But things are clearly different now. That's a parched milpa, or cornfield. So what's happening here is it looks like, no, that's not too strong. You see in these red areas, those are areas of drought. So life is always tough, but in these areas of drought, it is now a situation of near starvation. And this is called the Northern Triangle, this area of Mesoamerica. Okay. So, about 10.5 million people live in this area of Central America, in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Those are the places that we're talking about, the places where there's the most migration from. Interesting statistic. In 2007, 51,000 Central Americans were apprehended at the border, in contrast to 800,000 Mexicans, 2007. By 2017, 160,000 from this Northern Triangle were apprehended at the border, and only 128,000 Mexicans. So there's more Central Americans being apprehended at the border now than Mexicans. In 2018, farmers in the dry corridor, as it's sometimes called, lost half to all of their crops. Previous years, they had lost it all. It would seem that this is global climate change. Now that's Ramon Campos Lopez's, that's his, he has that up in his house. These are pictures of his relatives that are all in the United States. So now let's jump ahead to Guatemala. I'm going to have to leave you just for a moment. Head over to my technology. Now, with this, and it sure better work. Okay, those of you who know some Spanish, I want you to listen carefully. Listen carefully.
This may look like a lush landscape, but looks can be deceiving. These crops are inedible, the soil deteriorating rapidly. Millions of Guatemalans, like Darwin Mendez, are on the brink of starvation. With bare crops, it's an everyday struggle to feed his family and a constant hunt for food. The culprit is climate change. Extended periods of drought, followed by torrential rains, have ravaged land across the nation. Just last year, Central America was hit by 2 Category 4 hurricanes in a span of 2 weeks. Climatologists say it's only getting worse.
Las emisiones importantes de los países industrializados nos han modificado esa temperatura de la atmósfera y hemos sido pues víctimas de estos eventos que cada vez son más recurrentes.
The climate crisis contributing to
I hate it when this happens.
We'll get it.
This may look like a lush landscape, but the looks can be deceiving. These crops are inedible, the soil deteriorating rapidly. Millions of Guatemalans, like Darwin Mendez, are on the brink of starvation. With bare crops, it's an everyday struggle to feed his family and a constant hunt for food. The culprit is climate change. Extended periods of drought, followed by torrential rains, have ravaged land across the nation. Just last year, Central America was hit by 2 Category 4 hurricanes in a span of 2 weeks. Climatologists say it's only getting worse.
Las emisiones importantes de los países industrializados nos han modificado esa temperatura de la atmósfera y hemos sido pues víctimas de estos eventos que cada vez son más recurrentes.
The climate crisis contributing to the crisis at the U.S. border.
Climate change produces food insecurity because about a third of households in Guatemala are directly dependent on agriculture. A lot of them live on very small farms that just don't have a lot of buffer to recover. What some people might think of as economic migration can be driven by climate change.
Now that his crops are destroyed,
Porque iba a change Estados Unidos porque sí un día Estados Unidos atacaron más Estados Unidos. Los suelos a muchas y un siete alto desierto un siete 8 papacito 10,000 con gas.
faced with 2 choices, starvation or migration.
Extreme chica horsa automa horsa también para la se casar por todo todo que le paga que todo ya se son normal ya
If he makes it, his plan is to send money back to his family so they can stay and survive in their own country. But it comes at a major cost in a country where most make $6 a day.
Viaje como $30,000 casi que amigos
If he doesn't make it across, he says he only has one option.
I think climate migration and certainly Central American migration is something that is very far from most Americans' experience. You don't have any legal category, and almost no country does have.
Okay, now. This worked a half an hour before it started. Okay, so if you had, Spanish 201, at least, you probably might have noticed that he wasn't speaking Spanish. He's speaking his Mayan language. They're calling him Guatemalan. He doesn't think of himself as a Guatemalan. He's Mayan. And there are many different dialects of the Mayan language. I have no idea which one that was. He's Mayan. what does that mean? Am I ready here? Thank you. Okay. For Mayan people who have been farming corn for 1,500 years, not always successfully, the Mayan Empire began to collapse around 900, the Common Era, in part because the Mayan people cut down the trees from the hillsides, which meant that the water that landed on those hillsides rushed through and couldn't irrigate their crops. So they are not, some kind of environmental geniuses or something. They had a human-inflicted catastrophe themselves. But nonetheless, in these cultures, you see here, are the rituals over the corn. They're lighting candles, both to a Christian God, but especially to the same spirits that their ancestors lit candles to 1,000 years ago. Each stage of corn production is ritualized. The preparation of the seed, the planting. The milpas are understood as sacred. Milpas, cornfields. In their origin story, they believe that the gods fashioned human beings from corn, which is not unusual in the Navajo tradition. In their origin story, they believe that changing women rather, made human beings by taking cobs of corn, ears of corn, and rubbing them on her breasts. And the kernels came off and made the first Navajos. So people believe that they were fashioned from corn, made from corn, and now make themselves from corn. They refer to the corn as Vuestra Merced, your grace. These are the rituals that they do. The ground, the air is censed with copal, which is resin. The room is censed. There is a midnight meal. 2 days later, there are ceremonies of food offerings. You don't supplicate, ask for rain and success. You make ofrendas, you make offerings to the Chaks, C-H-A-C-S, which are the ancient Mayan deities. There is balche, which is a mildly intoxicating beverage which helps you communicate with the spirit world. So my point here is that this is more than an uprooting. And we saw that scene at the border. I think it was the second or third image I showed. We see what the perception is we get from the news. Either that this is a national emergency from one point of view, or, oh gee, it's a tragedy, we need to reform our immigration system. I'm saying it's much more than that. This is an uprooting unlike anything I think any of us can imagine. You were separated from your ancestors, you were separated from the spirits that have animated your corn for 1,000 years. Now, this is different. See, those spirits are only there in that place. This is different from, say, Italians or Poles or Ukrainians moving to another country, to another place, because their God is universal. So an Ukrainian Orthodox or Italian Catholic or Mexican Catholic can worship God in the new place. can revere the saints in a new place. From these folks, it is an untethering from the spirit way. Now, unfortunately, you heard it, but you didn't see it. And that was the Guatemalan agronomist who was saying that people are suffering from climate change, from the land and the water. The air is hotter, are all different. And he says, he uses the phrase that it has been the creation of los países industriales, the industrialized nations. So what's his mindset about why people are leaving? It's because of global climate change, in large part, which is the fault of the industrialized nations. So it's a complete reversal of who is responsible for this trouble, to put it mildly. Okay. We'll have questions and commentary in a bit. Yeah, the United States is not the only place that's in crisis about people moving. These are people in the Mediterranean from Africa. From sub-Saharan Africa, known as the Sahel. That is the area from where the Sahara Desert ends and the savannas of the south begin. Lake Chad. Look what's happened to Lake Chad. I mean, it's pretty easy. 1963, 73, 87, to where Lake Chad is in 2007. It has shrunk by 90% since the 1960s. 25 million people have, for 25 million people, their livelihoods have depended on the lake for agriculture, irrigation, fisheries, water for their livestock. Millions and millions of people have become food insecure. Of the 25 million, at least 10% have uprooted. Most have migrated within Africa, but a few of them are brave or courageous or foolish, we don't know. Ones have tried to get to Europe. More will surely follow. Where's Lake Chad? Or what's left of Lake Chad? In Senegal. These are the famous baobab trees. It's my understanding that baobab oil is big these days as a facial cream, I'm not sure. Some of them are 500 years old. Okay. The leaves are mixed with couscous and eaten. Bark is stripped to make rope. And their fruit seeds are used for drinks and oils. But they're also, like with the corn, sacred. A man named Seydou Kane, there won't be a test on this, who works in Senegal's Ministry of Culture, was circumcised under the baobab tree when he was about 4. The grown-ups told him that the trees were filled with spirits who grew angry if you touched the trunk. After the ceremony, he was told to nick the trunk of the tree with a knife. He gathered his courage, ran to the baobab, marking it with his blade. "You're a man now," he recalled the adults telling him. "You don't have to be afraid of anything." When he walked by the baobab tree, it was dead. The baobabs are the center of everything in Senegal. You see all the stuff going on here. You got people camped out, you got people parked under it. They have town hall meetings under the baobab tree. They're everything. In a place called Diok in Senegal, the new bride and groom circle the baobab 7 times after they are married. Funeral processions pause at the baobab tree before carrying on to a Catholic shrine. People will attach trinkets, everything from, a plastic flip-flop to rooster claws for good luck to the baobabs. There in Diok, by August, the millet, the plant that's supposed to be the new plant meat, should be waist high. In August, it's only ankle high. So, okay. All these, truly environmental causes are made worse by demography, certainly. The population of Africa will grow by 2050 from its current 1.2 billion to 2.5 billion by 2050. How is Africa going to manage this? Niger has the highest fertility rate in the world, 7.3 children per woman. We'll see its population multiply from 20 million to 70 million. So you see here that global climate change is only one of the destabilizing factors, without a doubt. Political corruption, civil wars, all these things contribute, certainly. In contrast, Germany and Italy will see their populations decline by 2 to 5 million, decline by 2 to 5 million. Now, there's plenty of analyses demonstrating the effect of severe droughts and desertification. Interestingly enough here, Syria. Where's Lebanon? At this point, before the revolution there, as the revolution was starting. Now, certainly in Syria, the most important thing going on is the brutality of the Assad regime and its resistance to any sort of popular protest, resistance to any change on the part of the people. It's not to say that climate change caused the Syrian war, but if your belly is full, you're less likely to revolt than if you're hungry. The same thing happens in the Sahel. In some areas, climate change and drought cause conflict over scarce resources. But mostly what I'm saying is that it acts as a threat multiplier. So, and again, 90% migrate within Africa, 10% try and go to Europe. One of the problems here the United States and Europe has is that we really don't have any thinking about how to deal with this. We have issues of refugees. Political refugees are one category, largely allowed. Refugees fearing violence are sometimes allowed in. Economic refugees are rarely, if ever, allowed in. There's no category for climate refugees. They are considered economic refugees. Okay? And this is one of the ways, in terms of policy, that the United States and Europe has to do some hard thinking and some policy changes. Right, so let's get to my quote here about my issue here with aggrieved nationalism. This is Syrians trying to get into Hungary. Now, it's curious that Hungary and Poland and some of these other countries are graciously welcoming Ukrainians. But Syrians are causing, you can't see that very well, the rise of anti-immigrant, aggrieved nationalism in Hungary. Well, they're different. They're not Slavs. Hungarians aren't either, but that's a whole other thing. And they're not Christians. Thus, they're not really welcome. And an outcome is the rise of anti-Semitism. In Hungary, one of the biggest campaign issues is George Soros, who has all these democracy sorts of institutions, including in Budapest and in other places. He's Jewish. They're saying that democracy and Western notions of liberty and freedom for all are some kind of Jewish, decadent Western plot. Okay. And that the Hungarians and the Poles say, and too many Russians, including Putin, says that we are victims of Western degeneracy. All these things, equal rights for women, gay and lesbian rights, democracy, and so on. And in Russia, this aggrieved nationalism takes the form of this recreation of Great Mother Russia under Catherine the Great, Nicholas II, the Great Patriotic War. So you see here that I think in the same way that often the so-called alt-right of Germany, of France, sees itself as aggrieved by these immigrants. In the same way that the far right, the Proud Boys and all those guys, also see themselves as aggrieved. Aggrieved because of immigrants, aggrieved because of the ways that new narratives are replacing their old narratives, the one that gave them a sense of belonging in the place. And that is all yet another issue with global climate change, is the instabilities that it is causing in terms of migration, utterly painful as we've seen here all too often, and then the response to those migrants creating destabilization in Germany, France, look at the election going on now, which is about immigrants, in the United States over immigration policies, yet another issue with global climate change. So I hope that my talk tonight, and I might have gone on too long, is challenging. I mean, when you think about it, you know, I remember last Thanksgiving, somebody read a list of all the things you're not supposed to talk about at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Well, I talked about a number of them. So it's my hope that this has been challenging, and I hope that this has been some good food for thought. And I want to thank you.